Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Monday edition of Point of View, and I'm so grateful that you could join us. Hope you had a great weekend. Of course, some of us have gone to some of these Christmas events, and that has certainly been fun. And before the hour, maybe next hour is over, probably a better way to say it, we'll see if we can talk about a few things that relate to the birth of our Savior, Advent, and a few things like that, if we can fit it in. But I did want to cover a number of different topics today, and also mention that we have a couple of guests. So I try to mix it up as much as we can. Going to talk about this whole issue of education reform. I'm going to maybe lead off with the whole issue of inflation and what I called as our second article, Economic Concerns and Media Cheerleaders. To their credit, both a left-wing and right-wing commentator have pointed out that there have been some people that have been sort of almost cheerleaders for the president, trying to say, inflation's not that bad, the economy's not that bad, and you know better. And so we're going to talk about that for a little bit. Then we're going to get into, by the bottom of the hour, a good conversation with our friend George Barna. We've had him on before. As a matter of fact, later this week, you will hear one of my commentaries I did from a previous interview on the fact that not that many Americans have a Marxist worldview. As a matter of fact, very, very few, but they do sometimes buy into Marxist ideas. So that is one that we've talked about in the past. This one is very good research on the emotional and mental health issues hindering millennial relationships. We will have a millennial roundtable this day, but it isn't just millennials. I have begun to notice that I have conversations with people saying, I or my spouse or my kids, they have been negatively affected by first the pandemic and the lockdown. And so we will get into some of that with him. Next hour, Donna Jackson's with us, which is with Project 21, a Black Leadership Network. Thought we would spend just a little bit of time, if we could, talking about some of these court cases. Ahmaud Arbery's case, probably the best one to focus on first, but Justin Smollett and a variety of others. So we have a lot to cover there. And before we're all done, maybe we'll get into a couple of issues. Matter of fact, one of the articles I've posted, whether we get to it today or later in the week, handles Messiah. And maybe a little bit on a couple of other things that put us in the Christmas spirit as we are going to be covering many of these issues. And historically, at least in the past, by now you start having Congress take a recess and we could do more of themes. Sometimes it was very difficult to get guests. Not this time. Matter of fact, we've got some guests in studio next week and the week after that oftentimes you would not have guessed. So we will talk about all of those later. But let me, if I can, come to our second article that I've actually posted. It's by Charles Cook, and he writes for National Review. So, and he's a conservative, actually British citizen who, has he become an American citizen? I honestly don't know. But nevertheless brings a great deal of perspective so often. But he starts off by quoting somebody from the New York Times, David Leonhardt, and I've read some of David's pieces as well. There are people over at the New York Times which sometimes it's hard to get past the first paragraph. But this one is interesting because he starts out by saying that David Leonhardt, writing in the New York Times, points out that in recent weeks, economists and pundits have been asking why Americans feel grouchy about the economy when many indicators like GDP, growth, stock prices, and unemployment rate look strong, before concluding that it's a supposed paradox. Well, Leonhardt says it this way: it's not really a paradox because Americans think the economy's in rough shape. He says bluntly, because the economy is in rough shape. And then goes through some of the things that you have seen before. But here is, to me, probably the greatest puzzle. I began to realize even decades ago that if you realize that most of the people in the mainstream media tend to vote Democrat, that when you have a Democratic president, anything that looks good gets a lot of press, anything that looks bad gets ignored, and vice versa. When anything is looking good, it's sometimes ignored, but when it's bad and a Republican president is in there, you hear it all the time. And Ronald Reagan, this goes back almost 40 years, said, I realized when the economy was starting to turn around because I started to notice that the various pundits were no longer talking about Reaganomics. Because Reaganomics was supposed to be a derisive term, and all of a sudden now they realized if they used the term Reaganomics, he'd be getting credit for that. That being said, really, it wasn't until I'd have to say, maybe, I'm trying to figure out a good date. Let's say, just say 1992, maybe something like that, maybe a little bit earlier. You started to then get some people making statements about how bad the economy was. And so you got George Herbert Walker Bush. Let's go then to 2000, 2001, George W. Bush. Anytime there'd be a downturn in the economy, it was major news. Anytime it did fairly well, you didn't hear about it at all. And of course, we remember, if you go back, say, 2 years ago at about this time, the economy was blowing and going. And you didn't hear a lot about that in terms of the Trump economy. And oftentimes they would point out something fairly negative. Well, that being said, you expect that with the mainstream media. And so he goes into this piece about, you have, for example, the Washington Post, Dana Milbeck, actually arguing with a straight face, which is amazing to me, that the press treats Biden worse than Trump. I think that's hard to make a case. That you then had Paul Krugman, who writes for the New York Times, propose that the public's highly negative assessment of the economy is at odds with every indicator I can think of. Joy Reid saying Republicans are so negative because the economy is booming. And you sort of expect that from opinion writers or pundits. But the next one was kind of interesting. CNBC, Jim Cramer submitted that the economy is better than he'd ever seen in his lifetime. And that one is a surprise because we recognize how many economic indicators are in bad shape. And then to simply look at that is pretty amazing. And then if he couldn't resist, then you have Charles Cook reminding us that then you had this published piece from the Democratic Congressional Committee with a tweet that said, thanks, Joe Biden, because gas prices went down 2 cents in 2 weeks. 2 cents in 2 weeks. I mean, you really are grasping at straws there, because then he asked, well, if that when the prices go down, that's Biden's solution. Well, if they go up, is that his problem? And of course, I have said on this program time and time again, sometimes presidents take too much credit when the economy is good and get too much grief when the economy is bad. There are certain things presidents can do, and there are certain things that presidents really cannot control. And I do believe that part of the issue, as we're going to talk about after the break, on inflation has to simply do with the fact that there has been too much money printing. And this particular article, if you'd like to read it in its entirety, reminds us that this has been happening long before you have an individual by the name of Joe Biden coming into office. A lot of that goes all the way back, and we'll talk more about this after the break, in terms of what was called the quantitative easing that took place after 2008. But if you thought they were printing money back in 2008 and 2009, you haven't seen anything until you go to 2020 and 2021. And then, of course, the desire to pass more and more legislation that will cost more and more and require more money printing. So we'll come back and talk a little bit more about that, and then we're going to get into some other issues. But I just thought, because we recognize there's so many people telling you the economy is good, I just want to help you understand you pay the prices, you pay the bills, you recognize the economy's got some real challenges, and we'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
To articles in the last few weeks raised serious questions about the effectiveness and efficiency of mail-in ballots. The first comes from a House election in Florida that was won by a mere 5 votes. This was a reminder of how close elections can be, especially in a primary in a special election. But the more important issue was the nearly 1,400 mail-in ballots thrown out in a Democratic primary that was won by 5 votes. Most of the mail votes had a problem with the Election Day deadline. Hundreds had missing or illegible postmarks. Nearly 300 were postmarked before Election Day but not delivered in time to be counted. In addition to those tardy ballots were 140 mail ballots rejected because they were unsigned or the signatures didn't match or had some other problem. In a second article, Dr. Merrill Matthews, quoting from the U.S. Elections Assistance Commission, reported that 560,000 mail-in ballots were rejected in the 2020 presidential election. He concluded that it would not have made any difference in any state that Joe Biden won over Donald Trump, but more than 500,000 votes would most certainly have made a difference in a few close state and local elections. In both cases, you have American citizens who did everything right and still did not have their votes count because of a problem with the mail service or because a signature didn't match. In other cases, the voters did nearly everything correct, but their vote wasn't counted. Despite what proponents of mail-in voting say, these two examples illustrate why it is better to vote in person, either with early voting or voting on Election Day. If you want your vote to count and don't live in a state that only has mail-in voting, then go to the poll and vote in person. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Critical Race Theory, go to viewpoints.info/CRT.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
But once again, just before we go any further, let me just acknowledge something, of course, over the weekend that all of us have been watching. And the current death toll in Kentucky, I think, is at 64. But these tornadoes... didn't the president say they were hurricanes? I'm pretty sure they were tornadoes. But anyway, that took those lives, and we were very encouraged to see that a lot of the initial interviews were with, again, various Christian-oriented groups. You know, the Christians that always get vilified for all sorts of things, and yet when there's a disaster, guess who sometimes shows up there first? Oh, it's World Vision, World Impact, Texas Baptist Men. It's, of course, a variety of others. I can go through a long list. You know them as well as I do, Samaritan's Purse, and on and on and on. Those are the ones that get interviewed, and they're the ones that show up. And I, again, want to salute all of you, whether you are part of a Christian organization or a first responder, for what you're going to be doing in Kentucky and many of these other countries, counties, and states as we go along. But anyway, let's get back to this. I actually forgot to mention that at the beginning, but while we're in the midst of talking about the economy, let's again go back to the second article. Has to do with the idea that so many people are trying to spin the economic reality. But let me give some credit where credit is due. Back in February, Lawrence Summers, you might say, well, who was he? Well, he was the Treasury Secretary under Clinton. He was head of the economic group under Obama. He was president of Harvard University. But nevertheless, Lawrence Summers warned that we may be just actually printing too much money, and there was a threat of inflation. And it was amazing how they treated a man who was, Treasury Secretary, a former president at Harvard, like he was some kind of know-nothing economic student or something like that. It was really a sad commentary. The other one I have here from Wall Street Journal reminds us that somebody else was concerned about that, and his name is Senator Joe Manchin. And he was concerned about the impact that this would have on the country, and in particular in West Virginia, where he actually represents that. And so he actually was very concerned about this, and now that the Consumer Price Index puts it at 6.8%, and you, again, if you've listened to this program, know I think that percentage is low compared to that, and I'll give you some reasons for that in just a minute. But even if you use that number, this makes it the first time in 39 years inflation has been that high. The attempt by the Biden administration has said, well, that's just due to car prices and energy prices. First of all, you've got to understand that a lot of the core inflation isn't using the energy prices, and that doesn't wash with everything else because, after all, you've got meat prices up 16%, furniture up almost 12%, clothing up 5%, and so, yes, you do have some volatility in food and energy, which is why they're not part of the core inflation, but it makes no sense at all. And again, they would say, well, it was used cars. Okay. Well, that may be true, but the surging of used cars is only a very small part of that. And so you, again, will have to acknowledge that some of these numbers get actually accepted if they look good for the president and ignored if they look bad for the president. And again, we've pointed out on numerous occasions that the Consumer Price Index really many times lowballs various costs, including housing costs. For example, the CPI says that housing cost only went up 3%, based on what is called the owner's equivalent rent, which is a sham for sure, and we've talked about this on this program. How about the fact that for those of you listening in what we call Sun Belt states, every one of those rent and housing prices have gone up at least 20%. So all I'm trying to do is, again, we don't want to overdo the numbers, but simply to say that just as we sometimes feel like people aren't always telling us the truth about everything from the virus and the vaccine and foreign policy and government costs and all sorts of other things, we have the same kind of issue there as well. And Jason Trennert actually even goes on to say, like it or not, when it comes to inflation, the word transitory started out as a forecast, then became a hope, and turned out to be basically a punchline. And nearly now you are seeing, of course, various stocks going up because they're close to the money printer. The S&P 500 has gone up about 25%. That's real good if you have money in the stock market right now. But I love his illustration here. I use this more for my producer than anything else. Jason says, like the Hotel California, you can check out anytime you want, but you can never really leave. This is especially true if one considers the fact that China is unlikely to be as a large a source of disinflation in the future as it was in the past, that there appears to be structural change in the number of adults who can or want to participate in the workforce, and environmental goals will increase the cost of doing business and also likely drive up the price of a variety of commodities. And the argument he's making is a good one. That is, at a very significant time when inflation is higher than has been in 39 years, might not be the best time to call for spending money, which is going to increase the deficit, increase inflation, and cost a lot more under the guise of trying to address the issue of climate change. And so he talks about the fact that right now you have to deal with some of these various currencies. And if you really want to know what inflation looks like if it's never under control, I will hold up this one. This is a Zimbabwe $100 trillion note. You might say, well, I can't really relate to a country in Africa. Well, how about Venezuela? Here is a bolivar from Venezuela. And I was just hearing a commentary where they were saying, would you, if you had the ability to, if you lived in Zimbabwe or Venezuela, convert to the American dollar And you, of course, would do that. You would try to get your dollars, your bolivars, and then turn them into dollars immediately. Now, more and more of them, like in places like El Salvador, they're converting them into Bitcoin and things like that because they just recognize that as these countries have gone, the United States could go if something doesn't change. And again, for those of you watching on the screen here, I'll just hold up the latest graph in which you see inflation just going almost vertical. So all of that to say, if you sense that maybe prices are going up, then I would highly recommend that you take a reasonable action in that regard and don't let people keep telling you that everything is just fine, because I think you intuitively know that it's not. One of the other articles that I have posted for you is the first article called Education Reform. This particular author, writing in National Review, believes that next year might be the greatest year for education reform, and the reason for that is pretty simple. I think parents have pretty much had it with what their kids are being taught, or in some cases not being taught in the schools, and so the fact is that we recognize that the kids that are, and the students that have been trying to learn online, this has not been working very well. Then they're learning all sorts of things about critical race theory. Sometimes they're being exposed to what many people call almost pornographic sex education. They're being subjected to mask mandates and all sorts of other things. And so you might say, okay, what can we do? And that's why I've posted this. This is an article that would, I think, be worthwhile for you to print out. Now, let me just hasten to add that if you make sure you put some money in your printer there, because some paper in your printer, because what you're going to find here, it's 10 pages long. But it really sets forth those of you out there that want to make a difference in your school district. After all, we're going to have an opportunity this next year to vote for people on the school board, and it has a very good 7-point plan that has been put together in which you have such things as no teacher or student should be compelled to affirm, believe, or profess or adhere to any idea that violates the Civil Rights Act of 1964. You have public officials should give all members of the public comprehensive access in person and online to school curricular materials, and on, just all sorts of really good ideas. And if you're going to want to run for office, maybe in school board, or you know somebody that wants to run for school board that would agree with you, this is kind of a perfect blueprint on what you can use to make a really significant impact. So I wanted this one to get out. We might later in the week spend some time going through each one of the points, but in some respects what I'm doing is putting it out for you to read now. Again, make sure you have enough paper in your printer because it'll take you 10 pages, but then we'll come back and talk about it, because I really want you to understand that there are some people that have thought deeply about, okay, how do we solve the problems? And we're all about trying to solve problems here at Point of View. So yes, we can talk about some of the problems of the way the school districts are going right now and the kind of curriculum is being taught, but are there some ways in which we can turn that around? And I've already passed this on to one individual running for the Texas legislature, and I certainly wanted to put it in your hands. So it's the first article, and we do need to take a break. When we come back, we're going to spend some time talking with our good friend George Barna. Donna Jackson with Project 21 will be with us, and then we'll get back to a couple of other issues in the news. But these are the first two articles. They're on pointofview.net. We'll be back right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook. @Point Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
I'll spend some time now talking with our good friend George Barna, and this will be focusing on the issue of millennials. As you know, we really do want to help you understand more about that generation. If you are a millennial, we certainly want to give you good advice, but for those of the rest of you trying to figure out this particular group of individuals, this cohort, whether Generation Y millennials or Generation Z, we certainly try to cover that on a regular basis. And this new report that comes from Dr. George Barna, again, is the director and president of the Cultural Research Center at Arizona Christian University, is on our website. And actually, it's just a summary of what you can find in their second in-depth report called Millennials in America, New Insights into the Generation of Growing Influence. And so, once again, George Barna, we're talking about adults ages, I guess, 18 to 37, correct?
Yeah, that's right. Those who were born between 1984 and 2002. That's what we looked at as millennials. Of course, different groups look at different age brackets, but that's how we define it.
And again, we're going to be talking about how sometimes they're dissatisfied with their relationships, as we'll get to in just a few minutes. When we look at emotional and mental health, oftentimes feel very anxious, depressed, and unsafe. This is a generation that you have looked at before, but you have some real issues that have surfaced. Some perhaps, George, because of the pandemic and the lockdown, others that were already there, but you do see almost skyrocketing rates of emotional and mental health, and a generation that says they're really pretty dissatisfied with their intimate and peer relationships.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, the government, of course, on a regular basis, National Institutes of Health, does all kinds of studies looking at the mental health of Americans. And they have identified some of these same kinds of problems. We've tried to put it into a different context that they don't look at, looking at issues such as their worldview, their faith, their relationships, their family, all of these things and more. Because when you look at a group of people that says, we're really struggling mentally and emotionally, as millennials are telling us, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. So in this study, where we find that 54% are telling us that they frequently have problems with anxiety, with depression, and fear. I mean, that to me is pretty alarming. That says, okay, there's a real difficulty here that we need to not only be aware of, we need to address it. But in order to do that, we have to put it in the broader context. And I think that the most helpful broader context has to do with the worldview of people. What would cause anxiety? What would cause fear? What would cause depression? And when you look at it through that worldview lens, I think it becomes a more powerful way of solving some of the problems.
And again, that's very important because, again, we've even talked about the Centers for Disease Control, for example, have talked about high rates of anxiety and depression, but we want to tie it back to some of the worldview issues. So let me take another one that is there, and that is you would assume that millennials would be like anyone else that would believe that you should respect others. After all, that's kind of the idea that you should have respect and tolerance. Yet one of the things that jumped out to me, George, was a minority of millennials embrace the golden rule, whereas, just to give you a comparison, 2/3 of other adults say that they follow that. The golden rule doesn't require you even to be a Christian. It just really requires that you believe that it makes sense that you would want to treat other people as they have treated you. Now, of course, Jesus talks about that, but even other religions have that concept. But you can't even get, and this is striking, a majority of millennials in your survey to say, no, we're going to practice the golden rule when we interact with other individuals.
Well, in Kerby, again, the bigger context on that is intriguing to me as well, because as we've looked at the fact that most millennials consider themselves to be Christian, about 2 out of 3 would claim that label. What we've come to understand is that for a large share of that group, that label has nothing to do with faith. It doesn't have to do with religious beliefs. More so, it's simply their way of saying, I'm a good person. And so that notion of Christians being good people, that's a reputation that they want, even though they don't connect with, they don't necessarily believe, in Jesus Christ. They don't even necessarily believe in the God of the Scriptures. And so in a situation like this where they're not buying into the golden rule, it's particularly perplexing because, again, what they're trying to do is have that reputation, that image of being a good person.
Yes.
And I struggle to understand how rejecting the golden rule makes you a better person.
Another aspect of that gets back to, again, worldview. If you believe that we're created in God's image, then you would certainly say that human beings have value and dignity. And at a time when we're talking about Black Lives Matter, later on we're going to be talking with Donna Jackson of Project 21, and we're going to talk about the fact that all lives have matter, and we should do what we can to treat everybody with respect and dignity. You find that half of millennials say they really attach no absolute value to human life. As a matter of fact, they're almost twice as likely as other adults to dismiss this idea of inherent value of human beings. That maybe fits with the idea that you believe we're just an evolutionary product and you reject the idea that there's any value in human beings. But this does not bode well for the future of this country or society if you have more and more individuals coming in positions of leadership that say, there's really no inherent value in individuals. These are the kind of individuals that are going to support everything from abortion to euthanasia.
Well, and as you say, you've got to go back and look at the underlying foundations of all of that. And part of it is their rejection of God. Part of it is their rejection of the Bible. And what happens in that kind of a vacuum? Something has to go there. And what this generation has decided is without God, without the Bible, without moral truth, really it just comes down to me and my feelings. So everything revolves around me doing what's best for me, what makes sense to me, what's going to propel me forward toward what I think of as success, which is not a biblical perspective such as consistent obedience to God, but it's more about being in situations and producing things that bring me happiness or satisfaction or fulfillment. So it's a completely different approach to God. And again, as you and I have talked about in the past, because we're syncretistic in our worldviews, we draw from many different worldviews, they're demonstrating a tendency to simply pull those pieces out of Marxism, secular humanism, postmodernism, nihilism, etc., that conform to this idea that, it all revolves around me. If I'm not happy, then there's something wrong.
I might just mention that, as you well know, I oftentimes take the George Barna material and then do a commentary. My commentary, I think it's on Wednesday, gets into the issue of Marxism, which we say, look, most Americans do not have a Marxist worldview, but they sort of buy into certain kinds of Marxist ideas. Also, you see this with humanism and all sorts of other issues. But one other one I want to put on the table maybe before we take a break, and that is the argument that is oftentimes made is millennials probably aren't as good at communicating face-to-face, and your research found, again, a loss of effective communication skills, partly attributable to the reliance on technology, using text and screens and those kinds of things. And that's another part of it, because you would hope that there would be interaction with other individuals that would encourage you to maybe change your behavior, to be more loving, to be more gracious. And yet, again, we are seeing a level of kind of, if you will, social isolation. They are on social media oftentimes, but as an individual actually interacting face-to-face with people, they're fairly socially isolated, aren't they?
Yeah, it's true. One of the difficulties with technology as the platform through which you try to develop and maintain relationships is that the impersonal nature of it facilitates some of the very problems that they're having in making and maintaining those relationships. For instance, keeping promises, respecting other people. Those are the kinds of things that are necessary if you're going to build trust with other people. Well, when in a social media environment, so much of the communication that takes place really is not geared toward being an honest, forthright, open, vulnerable type of individual. Those people get chewed up and spit out in the social media context. And so if they're relying on technology to be either the door opener or the platform that maintains relationships, that's going to be an uphill ride. And I think the other thing, too, goes to their definitions of love, which is really about feelings rather than about commitment. When you look at their difficulties with relationships, a lot of it has to do with commitment.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation for 3 more minutes with Dr. George Barna. That coming up right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back with George Barna for a few more minutes, again with the Cultural Research Center at Arizona Christian University. This particular, if you will, summary is about 7 pages long, and it's emotional and mental health issues hinder millennial relationships. You might remember the last time I had George Barna on, I put it there because I wanted you maybe to read ahead of time. And again, I might just point out that the third installment of that, which has just come out, Indifference to God, Jesus, and Bible Drives Millennials' Faith. So we'll talk more about that maybe in a future interview. But the best way to get all of this is, as I said before, you might want to make sure you have some paper in your printer, because if you'd like to get the entire Millennials in America, New Insights into the Generation of Growing Influence, I think that's 120 pages. So first of all, I might just say, do you have a millennial in your life? Likely, 18 to 37. Do you have those in your church? certainly. If you are in positions of leadership, if you're a pastor, a deacon, an elder, a Sunday school teacher, you're going to want to know all of this, and it is just striking, sometimes depressing, but again, we need to look at these facts face to face. And so this one today is on our website. We have, of course, a link, and there's a place where you can follow it to get Millennials in America, which is the entire report. George Barna, let's, if we can, talk about trust. We are talking about the fact that many people are looking for places where they can get some trust, and I found that a lot of people say, I almost never listen to television anymore, don't listen to as much news because I'm looking for a trusted source. And I'm really gratified and humbled that sometimes they consider, and I fully appreciate the fact they consider Point of View to be a trusted source. Well, this issue of trust is a big deal for millennials because do they trust government officials? No. Do they trust social media personalities? No. Do they trust entertainment celebrities? No. The top of the list are parents and friends. Then another one, college professors. You work your way down to pastors. The situation is, this is a generation where their ability to create a level of trust and to build relationships sometimes is missing. And so that's another big issue with the millennial generation, isn't it?
It certainly is. And what the data were showing us is when we asked them on a scale to rate how much they would trust all these different influence agents, when we got to pastors of Christian churches, only 1 out of 4 millennials say that they would always or almost always trust the pastors of Christian churches. Now, we know that we want to reach this generation, and we want to do it in relation to faith in Jesus Christ. But when only 1 out of every 4 of the millennials say that they feel they can even trust pastors, that means you've got an uphill climb to even get to the point where you can have the kind of conversations with them that you want. So to me, so much of what we're looking at in all of this research is challenging us to rethink the ways that we're doing ministry. It may not be bad, but it may also not be effective. And if we really want to be effective, maybe we're going to have to make some serious changes.
And again, it's amazing because, as you know, I've been doing surveys and even interviews, and I think we're kind of like the synoptic gospels. We're saying things a little differently, but we're all pointing to the very significant issue that we have a whole generation that says, I don't feel like a church is relevant. I don't feel like the Bible is relevant. I don't think that a pastor can be somebody I trust. And so there's going to be a real need, and that brings you to the last section here of where we have a majority of young adults, 54%, admitted to often feeling anxious, depressed, or unsafe. And really there is an incredible need to address their mental and emotional health issues. So on the one hand, George, we have individuals that maybe aren't connected to church. They're the unaffiliated, sometimes called the nuns, or even others that might call themselves Christians, but nevertheless, they don't see the connection between their issues, their mental and emotional issues, and the answers that can be found in God's Word, and the answers that can be found in the local church. And so I think it's going to be incumbent upon pastors and preachers and teachers and radio broadcasters like myself and others to show the connection between your deeply felt needs and concerns and the answers that can be found in God's Word.
Absolutely true. We have to remember that when millennials make decisions, more often than not, they're making them on the basis of feelings, not logic, not reason, not facts, but feelings. And so that has contributed to the challenge that they face of self-doubt. So many of them don't know who they are. They have kind of an identity crisis. And that's why we have exploration into all kind of sexual perversions and other things that are taking place. So, we have to remember that millennials don't see people and they don't see themselves the same way God does. It's going to take time for us to get them to that place. And this is part of a narrative that we've got to be sharing with, postmodernists, one of the popular worldviews in America today, talk about the grand narrative. Their grand narrative completely leaves out God. So as we are able to develop relationships with younger adults, the more that we can shift that narrative, the more effective we're going to be.
I would think, too, that we've had a number of people on this program lately that have been with ministries like Life Recovery in churches. And, George, it's kind of interesting because people say, do you see any difference in the way you do point of view? And I said, well, two areas. Number one, economics, which we talked about before you got on the air. And the other is the whole issue of mental health issues, because you also point out that the National Institute of Mental Health reports that 21% of U.S. adults have some form of mental illness. So, again, if a church develops a life recovery program, not that it can meet all those psychological needs, but can be a place of healing or even to direct individuals where they might receive biblical counseling to address some of those issues, that's another way in which you can begin to minister to not only millennials in particular, but the generations at large that are dealing with some of these mental health issues, that if the church begins to reach out and say, we're going to be a place where we can provide some accountability to help you deal with your addiction, address some of these issues of anxiety and depression, that also is going to be very helpful for the advancement of the gospel, don't you think?
Yeah, of course. And in that process, also having the opportunity to dive into their worldview. You know, I keep going back to that because I think it's so important. That's our decision-making filter in life. And so if we're making bad decisions, it's because we have a worldview that's leading us to those bad decisions. And so when I look at so many of the mental health issues that Americans, and particularly millennials, are struggling with, part of it goes back to the fact that they're buying into elements of Marxism, to postmodernism, secular humanism, worldviews that cannot help but lead humanity to despair or even to suicide, because of the kinds of propositions that they put forth.
Yes.
It's really only a biblical worldview that esteems the human being only because we're made in the image of God. He made us for his purposes. He loves us. He can redeem us. That's really our only hope. If we keep turning to Karl Marx and, you know, all these other philosophers with these offbeat worldviews, naturally we're going to be led down a despairing path.
Well, again, we always appreciate George Barna. As I said, I've even got one of my commentaries coming up this week on some of his research. We'll be certainly posting some of this as well. And we have a link to ArizonaChristian.edu or in the Culture Research Center. You can find it all there as well. And again, this is one of many particular reports we've talked about, but you might want to get the entire report, which is called Millennials in America, New Insights into the Generation of Growing Influence. And so, George Barna, thank you for joining us, and let's take a break. We have a lot more to cover, and when we come back, we'll get into some of these court cases that we really haven't talked about in detail, and hear from Project 21. All that coming up right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about some of these various trials and jury verdicts, because we've heard so many conflicting ideas and information. And I was heartened to see some of the comments that came from our friends at Project 21, which is the Black Leadership Network, and in particular, the comments by Donna Jackson. And so I want to talk about Ahmaud Arbery murder trial. We might talk about the Rittenhouse trial as well, and certainly want to get into the whole issue of Jussie Smollett. If you're not familiar, Donna Jackson is the Director of Membership at Project 21, has a bachelor's degree in accounting, as an individual that has worked in that area, but then in Arkansas, worked in a number of successful campaigns. For example, Governor Mike Huckabee and Senator Tim Hutchison, as well as Representative, now Governor Asa Hutchison. Also has a divinity degree from Charles H. Mason Theological Seminary in Memphis, Tennessee, and an individual that is oftentimes promoting free markets, entrepreneurship, and other kinds of ways in which we would have limited government. So, Donna Jackson, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure.
You know, it's been a while since we've had Project 21. We're going to try to fix that now on Point of View. So some of our listeners might say, I think I've heard of Project 21, but I don't know much about it. Can you give us a little bit of a background before we get into some of these trials and the verdicts?
Yes. Project 21 is the oldest and largest Black conservative think tank in the country. What we do is provide a balanced view for a lot of the narratives you see on TV when it comes to Black issues that affect the Black community. We're definitely for a free market. We're for free markets and capitalism, and we really preach that people should not be dependent on the government, but really self-reliance and self-determination, that everyone should be able to choose their own path.
And so, again, if you go to nationalcenter.org/Project21, you can find it, but you don't have to remember all that because we have those links there. And one of those is on this trial that came out of Georgia. Now, I might just mention, Donna, we have quite a number of listeners in the state of Georgia, but even a part of that, we have people all over the country probably know the story, the very tragic story of Ahmaud Arbery. Died on February 23rd, 2020, with a confrontation with a number of individuals, which I'm not even going to mention their name, but these are three men that threatened, held, and chased him, shot, and killed him. And then, of course, we have seen that they were charged with 9 counts, including malice, murder, felony murder, aggravated assault, false imprisonment, criminal intent. And the point that I think you make is that we hear so often that the justice system doesn't work for people of color. And I think here's a good example of where it rightly ruled in favor of the justice, which we are sad to say shouldn't have happened to him in the first place. But talk about this for a few minutes, because right now you're hearing that some people feel about the fact that maybe we should provide safe spaces for any kids that might be concerned about the verdict in the Arbery trial or the Jussie Smollett trial or something of that nature. How should we think about this? Because what we've posted is not only your comments, but comments from many of your colleagues.
Well, I think that there's some people that want to use race as a means to divide the country and to say that our institutions aren't just. That's so far from the truth. We need to stop saying that the justice system doesn't work for people of color. It absolutely does. It has, from the civil rights era all the way through today. What people remember and they forget, they always remember the protests during the civil rights movement, but they forget about all the lawsuits that were filed. Justice system that actually expanded the rights of African Americans and most Americans. Thurgood Marshall was one of those leaders that was part of the civil rights movement, that's all they were tasked with, was filing lawsuits with our justice system. And it's because of those wins is that the rights that we have today as African Americans, we enjoy. And our system is not broken. As long as people listen to the evidence and judge that against the rule of law, then you come out with a verdict, the right verdict, which you saw in this case, because our justice system is colorblind. Martin Luther King loved this country. He loved our Constitution. What he marched for, what he emphasized, is that we would be able to enjoy the rights of the Constitution, not destroy the Constitution or the justice system. And he saw our advancement as African Americans tied to white Americans, Catholic Jews, all Americans. He did not want us to be divisive and the division that we see today, but he saw us as being brothers together, enjoying this great Constitution that we have.
So well said. We have a booklet that I've made available in the past on this idea of a biblical point of view on criminal justice, and even in this article that we are making available to our listeners, and I would encourage you to read it in its entirety because we're only going to summarize it. But one of your other members, Martin Baker, said, let's face it, that we have a justice system that sometimes is imperfect because we as human beings are imperfect when we base things on emotional triggers. And you have probably, and your organization there at Project 21 have probably done a good job of pointing out that there has been such a rush to judgment in the press sometimes on some of these cases. And then we find out, and I'll use the example of the Rittenhouse case, that a lot of things that were reported as fact turned out not to be factual. And so sometimes this rush to judgment in the press and in the popular culture calms down a little bit once we begin to look at the facts of the case and justice does actually get done.
Absolutely. What we should be doing is looking at the facts, not the color of our skin. There's this rush to judgment that all of this is about a racial quota scoreboard. It has nothing to do with that. It has to do with the rights of individuals. Unfortunately, with the Rittenhouse case, it came out the way it should have, but there are people who think, and that's because of this influence of the critical race theory, that if you are a white, straight male, then you are guilty. Not guilty until proven innocent, not innocent until proven guilty. You're just guilty, and that is wrong. Critical race theory actually says that white people are born irredeemable. So they deny the foundations of Christianity, of Christ, that not even salvation can save them. And so they want this same kind of judgment to be rendered against individuals in our court system based upon this Marxist ideology that is actually against Christianity.
Then we also have a booklet on critical race theory. Donna Jackson with us. We have a lot more to cover. We will do that right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Two articles in the last few weeks raised serious questions about the effectiveness and efficiency of mail-in ballots. The first comes from a House election in Florida that was won by a mere 5 votes. This was a reminder of how close elections can be, especially in a primary in a special election. But the more important issue was the nearly 1,400 mail-in ballots thrown out in a Democratic primary that was won by 5 votes. Most of the mail votes had a problem with the Election Day deadline. Hundreds had missing or illegible postmarks. Nearly 300 were postmarked before Election Day but not delivered in time to be counted. In addition to those tardy ballots were 140 mail ballots rejected because they were unsigned or the signatures didn't match or had some other problem. In a second article, Dr. Merrill Matthews, quoting from the U.S. Elections Assistance Commission, reported that 560,000 mail-in ballots were rejected in the 2020 presidential election. He concluded that it would not have made any difference in any state that Joe Biden won over Donald Trump, but more than 500,000 votes would most certainly have made a difference in a few close state and local elections. In both cases, you have American citizens who did everything right and still did not have their votes count because of a problem with the mail service or because a signature didn't match. In other cases, the voters did nearly everything correct, but their vote wasn't counted. Despite what proponents of mail-in voting say, these two examples illustrate why it is better to vote in person, either with early voting or voting on Election Day. If you want your vote to count and don't live in a state that only has mail-in voting, then go to the poll and vote in person. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Critical Race Theory, go to viewpoints.info/CRT.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with Donna Jackson with Project 21. Perhaps you're hearing some things say, I'd like to know a little bit more about Project 21. We have a link to that on our website. You can even sign up to receive some of their updates. And if you'd like to interact with them more, certainly there are some other opportunities for you to pursue those. Simply find those at our website at pointofview.net. One of the other jury trials I wanted to talk about, because again, this is something that has been posted on the Project 21 webpage, is the number of members of your organization that praise the guilty verdict of Jussie Smollett. Again, I will be honest by saying the moment I heard it, my wife said, "Oh, that's terrible." I said, "I have my doubts," because, I've written a little bit about some of these fake hate crimes, and so there's some things that didn't quite fit. And to be fair, many of your Project 21 members voiced early skepticism about the story, and I know you were harshly criticized for it. Of course, anybody that criticized that but I think we now recognize that here's another good case of where justice actually reigned.
Absolutely. Listen, from the beginning, I knew that this was a hoax, and a lot of our members did. We try to make sure we have members in every area. We were familiar with the area and the likelihood that you would have a Trump supporter or Trump supporters in that area. We also knew that a lot of this was acting. There's a lot of crimes of opportunities that are taking place right now. A lot of people realize that there's a lot of animosity towards anyone that doesn't see things the same way they do. And so they make up these kinds of stories to divide people because they realize that that kind of narrative actually gains traction. But what I think that the best that I've seen is the fact that the police department in that area absolutely did a great job, because they realized from the beginning that this did not sound plausible. And the fact that our justice system worked 3 times within the last couple of weeks is praise to our justice system and the Constitution. But really what this was about, again, was about dividing people and spewing hatred for no other reason but the color of our skin. All of this goes against the very thing that Martin Luther King stood for. He said he had a dream that one day his children wouldn't be judged by the color of their skin. And today we're saying none of that is true. We absolutely think that people should be judged by the color of their skin, and we're going to condemn them even if they didn't do anything wrong. And that goes against the principles of God, the Bible, and is frankly un-American. And so I'm so grateful that this case was decided justly, just like the Arbery case and just like the Rittenhouse case. We need to get back to our Constitution, where individuals have rights and are not judged by their skin, but on the fact that they have the right to pursue happiness.
If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Donna Jackson with us. And again, I mentioned that one of the booklets we've been making available is on critical race theory. And one of the articles that I posted today, and we talked about an hour ago, was on people believing that education reform in 2022 might really move forward. And one of the reasons for that, in addition to the fact that a lot of parents are finding out their kids really didn't learn very much online education, or that there are some what almost be pornographic sex education being taught, but one of the most important flashpoints was critical race theory. And I've heard you say enough now to say that I would suspect that you at Project 21 think that has no place in the public school curriculum.
Absolutely. I mean, we have a teachers union who's more concerned about activism than academics. We're teaching kids about to divide themselves, to hate themselves, and even hate their own family members. Instead of teaching math, science, reading, writing, we're ranked last of all the industrialized countries in academics when it comes to education, K through 12 education, because the concern of the kids are not the most important thing. But these activists want to destroy anything that's American. And they are sitting down here, what I really consider as abusing children, because they're telling some kids that you are oppressed and you will never be anything but oppressed. So why even try if you're a person of color? And if you're a white person, they're telling you you are evil and you will never be anything but evil. If I told my child every day that he was dumb and he was stupid and he was never going to amount to anything, people would call that mental abuse. Why in our education system is that not considered mental abuse? So I am 100% against this narrative where teacher activists only care about their power with people in political positions than they do the welfare and mental ability and education of small kids.
Well said. One more thing, just real quickly. I know one of the things you posted on Friday was on the issue of abortion. Of course, we've talked about that as well. And one of the individuals that I certainly respect, your co-chairman, Horace Cooper, said that the ruling by the Supreme Court reaffirms the primacy of the Constitution. Also, one of your members, Gregory Parker, has even pointed out, which we've talked about on this program, that the greatest number of abortions are with minority children. And so whether you look at it from a constitutional point of view, which we do, or just from a sanctity of life point of view, which we also do, the attempt to allow individuals, in this case the state of Texas, to continue to prevent abortion. The figure is up to about 15,000 babies we think we have actually not aborted in the state of Texas because of the Texas heartbeat law. You have also focused some time and attention there at Project 21 as well, haven't you?
Yes, we have. And we absolutely believe in the sanctity of life. Listen, 19 million black babies have been aborted since Roe v. Wade. They basically wiped out an entire population, 40% of the black community. Even though we make up the smallest percentage, 70% of abortion clinics are in black neighborhoods, because individuals who claim to care about us have always had this mission that we were disposable people. And so they have absolutely 100% targeted us for eradication. And the fact that there's so many families in this country that are hurting because they can't have kids. They're going over to other countries to adopt children. They are on lists they're waiting for years. They're seeking medical intervention to have children. Not one baby that's aborted will be unwanted because there's so many families lined up to get those individuals. And it's absolutely, we're losing valuable human capital that could be change the world. Steve Jobs, I should remind people, Steve Jobs was one of those unwanted kids whose family gave him up. He was adopted, and now he's changed the way Americans and even the world functions. So we are absolutely necessary. We're wonderfully and beautifully made, God said. And the fact that they're finally moving towards these laws that will protect life is a step in the right direction.
Well, again, Donna Jackson's been with us. She is again with Project 21. If you would like to know more about her, if you'd like to know more about Project 21 and the National Center, all of that is available at our website at pointofview.net. You can click on either her picture or then the article on Ahmaud Arbery verdict or some of the others that we have there. And I think you will benefit from the great research that they're doing. And so, Donna, thank you so very much for being with us. And I look forward to the next opportunity.
Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure. Look forward to.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we will get into a couple of issues in the news. First of all, there is a very good piece that we've posted. It's our third article. We haven't gotten to it today, but we will. Big government socialism isn't working. I think you would figure that out, but that's one. Also, the way in which the White House in the last 2 days has been bending over backwards to try not to offend China. You just have to read it, and I'll just read it in its entirety because sometimes you just roll your eyes at some of the things. And before we're done, though, we want to recognize we're getting close to the Christmas season, so I've posted an article about Handel's Messiah. We'll talk about that, maybe talk about Advent, and end on a positive note. But we need to take a break. We'll be back right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. It's program note. Let me just mention tomorrow we're going to have Alex McFarland with us, and he will be talking about everything from apologetics to worldview. I know you really will enjoy him. Many of you that listen to him on American Family Radio certainly are familiar with him. He's been on the program with us before, but if you are not familiar, we'll certainly give you a chance to hear from some of the things that he has been doing effectively, and I know you will enjoy him, and maybe even will will want to ask a question or two. And let's mention that my third article here today is one that actually is written by Newt Gingrich, and it's titled Big Government Socialism Isn't Working. Relates to the booklets that we have. I know I've been holding up some booklets today, but for those of you watching online, it's nice to know there's some resources. One on capitalism and socialism, which pretty much just tries to answer some of the arguments people use against capitalism, and then one that I have done more recently on just socialism, really responding to some of the arguments being used to promote socialism. And if you have a young person that has been off at college and coming home soon and maybe taking an economics class, you might want to get those booklets, because they will have their head full of some things that might really surprise you. But Newt Gingrich points out that this whole issue of big government socialism really could be a very big campaign issue. And I thought it was interesting because a little bit later in his article, he points out a Rasmussen survey, which I have not seen. I'm going to try to dig it up, in which a majority of Americans describe the Biden administration as big government socialism. So you can see that if you are running as a supporter of the Biden administration or a person in the Biden administration's political party, that's going to affect you in the 2022 elections. He also suggests that maybe even in the 2024 elections. But Newt Gingrich does the same kind of thing I like to. Don't trust him, don't believe him, go ask some people. And there was a guy by the name of Lee Atwater, used to be with Biden. Bush. I don't know where Biden came up. Bush. George Herbert Walker Bush used a guy by the name of Lee Atwater, and he used to go to bowling alleys and ask people questions. You might say, why? Well, he just wanted to understand where kind of people were in the general world, because if you only ask the people inside the Beltway in Washington, D.C., you're going to get a really skewed view. Well, anyway, back to the point. Newt Gingrich says, go to your local gas station, ask people filling up their gas tanks if they think things are working. It's kind of back to what we talked about in terms of inflation. Oh, inflation's not bad. He said, then go to the grocery store, watch people coping with the rising cost of food, ask them if they think things are working. Then go to small businesses whose shipments are still hung up on container ships anchored off of Long Beach, and ask them if they think things are working. And ask people if things are working when a man who burned down the Christmas tree outside of Fox News in New York City, causing $600,000 in damage, I did not know that, is released from jail without bail, and he's back on the street before the paperwork for his arrest is finished. When 80 people break into a Nordstrom just outside of San Francisco and steal as much as they can carry, you know, Americans kind of know that something isn't working very well. And so he points out on issue after issue, problem after problem, it's clear that most Americans are convinced that big government socialism isn't working. And again, remember that Rasmussen poll in which they oftentimes, at least 53% of them, believe that there is a direct connection between the Biden White House and administration and big government socialism. So then goes on and talks about some of the issues that we have had to address before, and talks about the fact that even big government socialism seeks to control our bodies through vaccinations, mask mandates, and of course then he goes into radical indoctrination in the schools, which we just talked about a minute ago with Donna Jackson and the rest. And so the point he's making is these ideas really are foreign to Americans. They've read about them before, as he talks about on page 2 in, like, I don't know, Huxley's Brave New World, or George Orwell's 1984, or Animal Farm, or Friedrich Hayek's book, The Road to Serfdom. But these feel a little bit more like what you've seen in really authoritarian countries, not necessarily here in the United States. And so he then goes and says, in some respects, big government socialism can be understood through 2 Walt Disney movies. And I love that, because sometimes just to try to communicate, especially if you're going to try to communicate to kids, big words like socialism, government, totalitarianism, they're just too big. And he says, for example, the inability to deal with violence, whether from criminals, terrorists, or nation states, can be compared to someone who sees The Lion King and thinks it's a documentary. They believe lions and zebras like each other and sing and dance. Why not release murderers, rapists, robbers, and others back into the population? And so he points that out as well. But then he says, this, I think, illustrates the fact fact that it doesn't work very well. And so he says the inability to design an effective economic policy of opportunity for all stems from the big government socialist failure to understand the 1934 film The Grasshopper and the Ants, which is based on the Aesop fable, which describes two different approaches to life. The ants work constantly through warm, pleasant days of summer, storing up food and preparing for the winter, which they know is coming. The grasshopper enjoys life, thinks all hard work is a stupid waste of time, and makes fun of the ants singing, "The world owes us a living," telling the ants, "You shouldn't soil your Sunday pants like those other foolish ants. Come on and play and sing and dance." So anyway, it's kind of fun to use some of these. Well, you know the rest of the story, I would think. As winter approaches, the grasshopper faces starvation while the ants are comfortably surviving the cold in a warm place filled with food. Only the ant's generosity saves the grasshopper from starving to death. In the end, he's singing a different tune, "I owe the world I live in." And so he says big government socialists share the grasshopper's disdain for work and favor policies that encourage dependency, indolence, and redistribution. If you don't want to study and succeed in school, the big government socialists will simply abolish grades so you don't feel bad. If you work hard and save, the big government socialists will take your money to give it to others who have learned to be dependent on the government. If you've been diligent and acquired some property, the big government socialists will tolerate criminals who steal your hard-earned goods and vandalize your home or business. Under big government socialism, there eventually be no ants to feed the grasshoppers, or as Margaret Thatcher, that is the Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, used to say, the problem with socialism is to eventually run out of other people's money. And so, again, it's an interesting little piece. I thought you would enjoy reading it because he takes us through how we can communicate this, maybe not just to adults who know big words like totalitarianism and socialism and authoritarianism and things like that, but maybe just a little bit of going back to something like as simple as the Aesop fable or the film, The Grasshopper and the Ants. And it's a really good piece. Which reminds us that if you are running on a platform of big government socialism, don't think it's going to work quite as well in 2022 as it seemed to work in 2020. Just before we take a break, let me just mention that we have been seeing so many individuals trying to avoid saying or doing anything that might offend China. You have, for example, as much as I love basketball, the NBA right now has banned pro-Tibet, pro-Hong Kong, pro-Uyghur banners in its arenas. Of course, you can't ban one person that put him on his shoes who plays for the Boston Celtics. But now the White House had what's called a democracy summit. And yet the problem was this. There was a video feed in this domestic democracy summit, which then came to be an international democracy summit. And the video feed of a minister from Taiwan was cut because Joe Biden's Summit for Democracy was afraid that while he was speaking, you could see a map in her slide presentation which showed Taiwan in a different color than China, which then would, of course, suggest that Taiwan sees itself as a separate country, which it does. But, of course, that would offend China. So sources said that the Friday slideshow by the digital minister from Taiwan, Audrey Tang, caused so much consternation that they just simply removed that because, after all, we just don't want China to be offended, even by a map that shows Taiwan in a different color. And I know why we're bending over backwards. We owe a lot of money to them, or they have bought a lot of our treasuries. All those are being converted pretty quickly. And over time, they won't actually own us at all because they're not renewing some of these long-term treasuries. So they're into us right now, but they need us and we need them. But still, we don't want to hurt their feelings. And, of course, NBA don't want to take a chance that they might not watch NBA basketball. So they go out of their way to apologize for a country that does not deserve that apology. Anyway, that's my view. When we come back from the break, we're in the midst of Advent. And the other day when I did an interview with Mark Yarborough, I realized we never really explained Advent. Oh, yes, you Catholics, you Lutherans, you know about it, but let's educate everybody. We'll do that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just mention we'll have Alex McFarland with us tomorrow. But I thought as we get closer to Christmas, we'll do some kind of Christmas themes, at least to end each one of our programs, because it's certainly important to recognize how so often we have seen the world affected more by kind of a cultural Christmas rather than a biblical Christmas. One of the reasons why we oftentimes make available our Christmas quiz. And the other day we had Dr. Mark Yarborough with us as we talked about his new book, Tidings of Comfort and Joy, 25 different short devotions, which really help us get into the Advent season. And of course, we find ourselves already 13 days into it if you look at the way he's divided it. But I thought when we were talking about Advent, we really never explained that. And so if you'll permit me for just a minute before we get to our last article on Handel's Messiah, what is Advent? Well, the Advent season usually starts on the fourth Sunday before Christmas, leads up to the Nativity, but in the past also led up to a teaching of the Second Coming. I'll talk about that in just a minute. So ultimately, it lasts for about a month. Now, the word Advent comes from the Latin, which is adventus, which means arrival, and really it's essentially the translation of the Greek word parousia. You didn't know you're going to get a seminary level class here. I won't do any more Greek or Latin, but I thought it was important because it's talking about the arrival or the coming of Christ. Now, we know that Advent was started long before the 4th century, but the first mention we have of Advent is from the Council of Saragossa, which was 380 A.D. Now, what they were dealing with at the time is a Gnostic heresy. You might remember when we've talked about Gnosticism with people like Doug Grotice or Darrell Bach or a number of others. Gnosticism is this idea our physical bodies are evil, they're not good, but the soul is. And so Gnosticism, at the time the heresy was known as Priscillianism. You didn't know you're going to get some church history, too, but it's free of charge here. And so if you're wanting to counter this idea that the body is evil or the body is not good, one of the best ways to counteract it is with the what? Incarnation, where God took on human flesh. And so we have the declaration that came from the Council of Saragossa, in which they actually called for Christians to celebrate this time of Advent, which apparently had already been taking place, from December 17th to the 29th by attending church at least once a day. Now, if you look at Advent in the past, we no longer do that. Advent was actually divided into 2 parts. 2 weeks focused on, of course, the incarnation. That would be the first coming of Christ. And 2 weeks focused on the second coming, that is the coming judgment. And so this was, I think, a reminder that Christ has come, but Christ is coming again. And so that's how it used to be divided. And so when you think about Adventus or Perusia or Advent, you can see where that came from. Well, there's some traditions that have grown up around that. One, of course, is the Advent wreath. And that has various evergreens, kind of signifies the idea of continuous. You know, there's no beginning, no end. So it's like, it symbolizes like the eternality of God. It would certainly emphasize the immortality of the soul, and most importantly, eternal life in Christ. But I had somebody the other day say, why the candles? Why the colors? What do those mean? Well, most of you are in a church, if you have the Advent candles, where you have 4 of those candles, and each one is actually lit each Sunday. 3 of them are purple, because the color violet is kind of a liturgical color. It was also a kingly color. You know now today it's much easier to make purple, but back then you had to crush these various shells to make purple, so only the wealthy and the royalty could have it. And then one of the candles is pink. I'll get to that in just a minute. So the first candle, that's purple, symbolizes hope. It's called the prophecy candle, and that relates very much to one of the booklets we have on the prophecies of the coming Messiah, especially Isaiah foretelling the birth of Jesus. The second was, of course, purple, and it represents faith. It's oftentimes called the Bethlehem candle, and it's a reminder of Mary and Joseph's journey from Nazareth all the way to Bethlehem, about a 90-mile trip. If you've watched more recently The Chosen Christmas of the Messengers, they have Mary on a donkey. No evidence she rode a donkey. Maybe she did, maybe she didn't, but we don't really know. But nevertheless, imagine whether on a donkey or walking 90 miles. I mean, we're talking about at least a 4 or 5 day trip, at least. Then the third candle is pink. That's the one that most have already just lit yesterday, and that is symbolizing joy because it's called the shepherd's candle. And it's rose is kind of the liturgical color for joy. And then the final candle is called the angel's candle, a separate, really symbolizing peace. And if you remember, the angels, peace on earth, goodwill toward men. We're going to do a lot more of that. We'll do some thumbs with the Christmas quiz. Matter of fact, I might just mention one of the chapters in Mark Yarborough's book is kind of a Christmas quiz, so we will certainly do that as we go along. But our last article for you today to read, and I think you'll really enjoy it, is, of course, Handel's Messiah. The composer George Frederick Handel, born in 1685 in what is now Germany. Although his family discouraged him from a musical career, he had just incredible talent, so ultimately that's the case. And so young Handel found himself in Italy, where he began to write operas. 1712, he moved to London, where many were fond of these Italian operas, and he could find a market for his talent. For nearly a quarter of a century then, he composed all sorts of popular operas and things of that nature, mostly for the royal court. And at that time, of course, Britain had a German-speaking monarch, George I, so in some respects, Handel was kind of the right man in the right place at the time. He became a naturalized British citizen and the rest. And then in the 1730s, operas were a little less popular in Britain, so in financial trouble, he sent a manuscript to an individual titled Messiah. It was a sequence of Bible passages which told the whole story of salvation from the fall of humanity through Jesus, the suffering Messiah, to Christ's future triumph. And, of course, there was an idea of actually setting that to music, and so he was inspired by the text. So, as a result, turned it into what, of course, we know today as an oratorio or English language opera without staging or costumes, but just had tremendous energy. And in a remarkable burst of creativity, wrote the music in 24 days. Handel's Messiah, written in 24 days. I don't think anybody knows that. And at the very end, wrote SDG. What did that stand for? Solo Deo Gloria, to God alone the glory. And, of course, then first published and then ultimately performed in Dublin in 1742. King George there at the first performance at one point, then the king, possibly thinking it was a national anthem of heaven, rose to his feet. And, of course, if you've ever been to Handel's Messiah, you know what you do ever since. And Handel eventually died 1759, was given a state funeral at Westminster Abbey, attended by thousands. And as a matter of fact, he's commemorated by a statue holding the manuscript, I know that my Redeemer liveth. Well, anyway, it's a very long piece. I just gave you the highlights, but if you'd like to read a little bit more about Handel's Messiah, it is the last article on our website, and I make it available to you as we get into the Christmas season. And look forward tomorrow to spending some time with Alex McFarland. I know you will appreciate his expertise as an apologist and as a worldview speaker, and just a very gifted individual. First of all, let me thank Doug again for stepping in as our help as an engineer, and Steve for, of course, the producer that makes all of this possible. Hope you learned a little bit today on Point of View, and we look forward to seeing you next time right here on Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.